Hello and welcome to another spoiler episode of Umineko. This video is going to contain spoilers for the entirety of Umineko, so don't watch, don't listen. If you have not read the entire thing, you'll both be confused and spoiled on huge stuff. And this is going to cover parts 13 and 14 of episode 3 from my Let's Play, which pretty much covers the final Twilights as well as the bonus murder of George. And we're going to first go through thematic stuff from this section before digging into then the, whodunnit, what happened, logistics of the murder stuff, because there's some new thoughts and weird changes I have to put on tape. Because my understanding of the situation has had to evolve somewhat. Here we get more talk about grief and amounts of time and the difference those things make. For instance, Battler talks about how huge a future George could have had with Shannon as compared to Battler already having a past with his parents. In some ways almost implying that to Battler he'd got to live the life, and that makes it still tragic to not have any more time with his parents, but it is more tragic to have the potential cut off. We talked before, especially with the NV math, how large amounts of time can be potent, but it's almost inverted here in parts where small amounts of time can be incredibly concentrated and potent in that sense. Later in this section, George will talk about how he would throw the rest of his life away if it meant he got to have even a moment with Shannon, because that moment would be so potent as to outweigh the rest of his life. And this kind of serves to underscore that all of this stuff is not actually maths. All of this stuff is judgment calls. All of this stuff is based on very personal and very subjective valuing of exact situations and things. If truly George cares about Shannon more than any potential future he could have without her, then none of his future matters as much as a future in which he'd have a sliver of time with Shannon. A thing that interestingly complicates this is George doesn't have a lot of future time left. George has one night. And yet he doesn't know that. When he gambles his whole rest of his life away, he does so thinking that he might live to old age. So there's a huge weight behind the collateral he is putting down, even if you only wanted to look in purely objective measurement, he's actually not putting down nearly as much as he thinks. But the emotional weight behind it still matters and still exists, and the emotional weight behind it is what moves Beatrice, even though she knows George does not have as much time as he thinks. And the reason that matters is because that's part of the lesson that Battler is teaching to Beatrice, that Battler is not purely trying to just teach Beatrice that life matters. He is trying to get Beatrice to understand other people's angles and views on life and what does matter and love and their interest in it. A lot of Beatrice's early mocking of Shannon and Canon and their love lives is because Beatrice is very cynical about love because of her own personal experiences and is unwilling to accept that anyone else might have other experiences with it, or at the very least is unwilling to accept that Shannon or Canon might have found a more real and sincere love that she lacks. Stay tuned tragically for episode 4, where in episode 3 she's learning to trust in the idea of love, and then in episode 4, I don't think that's going to be borne out for her personally. We'll get there. And tangentially off of that, there's a small bit of the recurring idea that Virgillia could theoretically have reached the same kind of power Beatrice had, and Virgillia chose not to ascend to that level because of how terrifying that amount of power would make her. We see later, when Beatrice no longer has her easy powers of resurrection, she feels a lot of weight and value behind resurrecting Shannon and Canon. And just like with human life, just like when you are not an endless witch, it's because these things have meaning and value when they are limited resources. This is similar to the golden drop stuff from the end of the last episode. The golden drop is not actually precious, it's only a fake commodity if you can resurrect a person over and over again to get multiple golden drops out of them. But if you are a human, or if you are a non-endless witch, there is something more precious to your magic, to its limitations, and having to engage with those. And I think this is an interesting parallel to Eva, who, at least as far as this episode depicts, could not resist taking all of the gold in the pile. She couldn't resist having a smidge less of the power. She couldn't resist the possibility of sharing the power, or worse, having someone else have more of the power than her. Even though ostensibly her siblings would have accepted her as the one who solved the riddle and found the gold, the possibility that maybe they would overturn her managed to kind of devolve into the idea that she wanted all of the gold. She did not want to share it in the slightest. And in a similar way to being an endless witch, it is such a huge, pointlessly large amount of gold that it is symbolic more than it is actual resources she needs. Especially the idea of controlling it is again mostly symbolic and not really representative of how much money she needs. Because again, she needs a lot of money, and we know what that is, and is nowhere near the ostensible mountain of gold value that she has claimed as her own. A brief note is, I really enjoyed this episode for Beatrice being very childish, but in good ways, in a sense. One thing I found fun reading through the first time, especially with when we get to the end of this episode and she does the turn, I was still certain that this was not all an act on Beatrice's part. Partly because it would be such a weird move to have hours and hours of your very long story have a character just entirely be out of character, and that in fact fits the themes of the story because you should trust the author and trust what they're telling you and not constantly try to undermine or think around what they're saying to you. But specifically, in this section, Beatrice has some funny moments where she asks Battler to just tell her what she has to do to make it up to him, which is incredibly childish. It is the very classic thing where a child doesn't want to have to think about the things they have done and parse the harm they've caused. They just want to be told how to fix this problem. They want to be told how they put the vase back together. They don't want to learn that they need to be more careful with precious things. And then, again, a very fun thing where Beatrice says, "Letting everything inside my heart show up on my face is part of my personality. I cannot deceive." Which is very funny for this episode, because one, she is pulling a huge fast one on Battler, but also, she's kind of not. Her actions in this episode are sincere. They are part of a sincere ploy. It is both a way to make Battler warm up to her so they can resume their game, so he'll be happy with her, including some very fun stuff that's going to happen at the very end. But also, she is learning real lessons. She is genuinely upset when she realizes that Battler is actually just unwilling to even engage with her because of how far she is pushed. And she truly did enjoy all of the murder game stuff. And she just shamelessly showed that to Battler, thinking that it was a harmless thing to express because, again, he has a different take on what's going on than she does. Also, one other quick note I want to bring up, even though I don't know if it'll go anywhere in future videos. Ronove is in a funny spot in this episode because of the way in which he gets handed off to EVA-trice, and for some time I was confused as to why he was telling EVA-trice all of the really cruel stuff that Beatrice had been doing, because it seemed to actually be sending EVA-trice down a bad path. Until I realized, oh, he's doing that intentionally so that Beatrice can see from another point of view the kind of person she has been. Ronove is very selective about telling EVA-trice stuff, and he will freely tell her lots of stuff and purport to be her butler, but a thing about being a butler or being hired help is you can still find ways to selectively tell your master about things. He covers for George and Beatrice in one case, so he's clearly not just loyal to his new master. So he must be telling EVA-trice these things for Beatrice's sake. Which, in the end, has me thinking about the fact that Ronove and Virgillia are in this episode as hints. They're here to be helpers, they're aids to basically help the game. Both to help Battler, but also to help Beatrice, because Beatrice has played the game twice the same way now, and it's not going to go anywhere if she keeps just doing it the same way over and over again. The two of them appearing in this episode help to massage things and push both of them in different directions. Battler learns about some of the ways he should engage with magic. Ronove can chide Beatrice and sort of redirect some of her energy. At the same time, Virgillia suggests the tactic that Beatrice should use in order to ingratiate herself better with Battler and be less antagonistic constantly. Alright, let's talk about Eva. Eva is not in a great headspace in this section. She has lost Hideyoshi, and what's worse, spoiler alert, but she's heavily involved in the murders that are happening, but not the sole actor. Because, yes, you would wonder why would she kill Hideyoshi unless she was badly forced to, and I don't think she did personally. But a lot of what she says in here, she is blaming the witch. She is separating herself and EVA-trice as individuals to try and absolve herself from actions that EVA-trice has taken. Even though she waffles on that in ways where sometimes she is reckoning with the fact that EVA-trice was born of Eva, but at other times she is more willing to separate them from each other. And I think that speaks a little bit to a difference between what Eva herself personally enacted and what she maybe had an accomplice carry out on her behalf. Eva acknowledges that she's responsible for the birth of EVA-trice, and an interesting parallel is that even EVA-trice does not want to acknowledge responsibility for killing Hideyoshi. Her response is, I didn't want to kill Hideyoshi. He was just so annoying and persistent, and that's your fault. It's your fault for choosing a husband like that. This is an even bigger deflection, not just trying to insinuate that a different individual was technically the killer. This is just straight up saying, well, he wouldn't even be here if you had just picked a different husband. It would have gone along with our murder plan better. Maybe you just shouldn't have had a husband in the first place, because you're just going to be the head anyway. Why do you need a family? EVA-trice is doing the exceptionally childish thing here of finding literally any other reason to insist that it was not her fault. Even though she's doing this in response to Eva having already somewhat shoved the blame onto EVA-trice. There's a somewhat tragic response where Eva is saying everything is her fault. Why did she resist doing what Rosa told her to? Why couldn't she just announce that she had found all the gold? She is now reckoning with the things she did wrong, things she could have done differently, and upset with herself, talking down to herself, saying she is hideous, and she has an evil heart that spreaded the desire that caused EVA-trice to hatch. But Ava's not doing anything to deal with that situation. In the short term, it is obviously difficult to try and come clean to her family and try to get them all to safety or do anything about the situation they're in. But in the longer term, we know that even with Angie, she never quite manages to reconcile with these things, and she's going to have a hard life where she's just given up and decided to be the witch people think she is. We'll have more to talk about that in the ending of this episode, because there's some stuff to come there. But in this moment, she's still not able to get to the stage where she is doing anything to deal with the problems she has caused. She is only wallowing, and I think also in part that's because there's a little bit that's still thinking she could take the headship. George is still alive. She still has a chance, in theory. Even as the number of people dwindles, it becomes less and less likely you could look at Ava and think she is innocent of anything. And this confrontation between Ava and EVA-trice ends with Ava not even quite able to answer the question to herself of, did she kill the people? Did she kill Hideyoshi? Or did she not? We'll talk in the Whodunnit about literally what events might have transpired, but at the end of the day, this mostly boils down to the fact that Ava is definitely a principal agent in the murders happening on this island, and if she had not been actively working in this way, then people might not have died, people might have been safe, people might have died differently maybe, or been protected. Lots of different things could have happened without Ava initiating the process that has brought us to this point. With a brief interlude, we have a scene of Klaus and Natsuhi talking to each other, where Klaus talks about his regrets about being an oldest sibling that perhaps has mimicked their father a little too much and taken too much of his example. How he hopes that his siblings could understand that this is a bit of a front and that he does care about them, but he should have maybe taken more of an initiative to do this more often. This is very sweet, but I think this is a fake conversation. I'll get to more specifics later, but there are lines that imply that this conversation didn't happen because they weren't here in the first place. They're about to get yanked out by magic into the courtyard. I think they were just out being murdered already, and that this is an Ava alibi to claim that they were there while she went to the bathroom. So, similar to conversations Natsuhi had with Kinzo in earlier episodes, I think this is perhaps a conversation that Ava is imagining Kraus might have. Which in one sense would imply that Ava does understand that this is a feeling Kraus could have in his heart, which I don't think is untrue. I think this is the kind of thing he might feel and never be able to express to his siblings. But it feels a little bit tragic about the idea that it is projected by Ava as she is killing them. Or having them killed, but I think she's involved. Then we come to Beatrice reviving Shannon. This is interesting because, in a sense, Shannon's body never died, and that is part of why Beatrice can revive Shannon. Again, to preview some Whodunnit stuff, I believe that will be crucial to why George has left the guest house and wandered into the mansion by himself, but this uniquely makes Beatrice able to revive Shannon because what is involved there is less of a biological impossibility, and it is more a difficulty in reopening vulnerability. Beatrice killing Shannon and Cannon is Beatrice closing off possible futures or closing off people she could be, closing off lives she doesn't think she could have, even as other people claim they could. As much as Shannon believes she could have a future with George, or believes she could have a relationship with George even if the future that George wants is compromised, Beatrice does not believe in that and has only now gotten to the point where she's willing to believe that there is value in this, that even if it is brief, even if it is interrupted, even if it is not going to be the pie-in-the-sky dreams George might have, that what they do get will be valuable, and will be valuable enough to be worth opening up the vulnerability that Beatrice is terrified of. The logistics of this pretty complicated and nebulous because I am unclear to what extent Beatrice might have been open to George about the nature of Shannon or how she was being revived, for instance. And as tragic as it is that this gets taken away in an instant by EVA-trice, for no reason, she doesn't realistically have to do this but has decided to, it is still validated because when Beatrice has done this, the effect it has had on George and Shannon is still meaningful. George is still pleased to have gotten this result. He's happy that she did it. He's happy that he got to be with Shannon, even for moments. And notably, as self-centered as a way this might have been if Beatrice thought of it this way, it's still meaningful because of the effect it has on Beatrice. The growth that she has here continues. Even if George and Shannon have died, Beatrice, continuing on, has become a better person and has learned from their experiences and has gotten something from their love in a way that, even though most of the Ashura Miyas are going to be killed off on this island this weekend, those who remain still get something from their existing family, assuming they can look at things in that way and not, say, get caught up in finding the truth of an event that is in a black box that might haunt them for years and years. And then to circle back on Eva briefly, we end this section with the pretty explosive argument between her and Jessica that involves Eva accidentally pulling the trigger, that involves the gun going off in a scuffle with Eva and Jessica. And I think it is no accident that Battler is not paying enough attention to see the literal events that happened. He only sees the beforehand and the aftermath, and then is left to draw conclusions from it. Battler himself keeps his options open. He does not immediately think, did so-and-so pull the trigger? Is this what happened? He asks multiple questions about what might have happened without coming to specific answers or conclusions. And in a different, but no less significant way, Eva is insistent that it couldn't be her fault. It only happened because Jessica came at her. And the line in the narration, it seemed that Aunt Eva couldn't conceal her trembling at the fact that she had pulled the trigger, even if it had been an accident. And I don't think it's a big leap to say that this might be a line about more than just Jessica and what happened with her, and perhaps some other events that have transpired over the course of this weekend. And she starts asking who killed George in a way that does throw suspicion off of her, because why would she kill her own son, her precious boy that her life was devoted to? With that, it's some whodunit time. So I have some thoughts about the 7th and 8th Twilights here and what happens with George in this section. It's quite heavily hinted that Natsuhi and Kraus were not in the room where that conversation was being shown, because when Eva returns, the narration implies that she's acting out a scene as if she should expect them to be there. When she checks the seat for their warmth, when she looks around for where they could be, and she sits down and waits, rather than immediately going, where the hell did they go? She's not panicked. She is getting her story straight for what she was doing, and I think Eva herself did have to go kill them. I think Beatrice, the accomplice, was also involved. So my suggestion for what happened has a few moving parts, but I think for this to work, Nancy and Kraus need to leave the guest house to go and talk outside. Now, I don't entirely know why they would do this without any prompting from anyone else. In theory, they might... In theory, you could say that they are trying to discuss the gold because they're suspicious of other people, but Nancy and Kraus are not the smartest pair of the group. They probably know some shit is up. Even if they know some shit is up, I don't know if they would be strategic about figuring that stuff out. It feels more likely that either Eva or the accomplice would lure them out of the house by one mechanism or another. Exactly why or how, less clear. Wanting to talk in private, especially if they are suspicious of Eva or trying to figure out what's going on without Eva's interference, those feel like reasonable reasons they might go out and sit in the garden. And obviously, they go to the one place that is sheltered from the rain. whereupon they're snuck up upon and both strangled. Now, I said before, there's a possibility that there's multiple living accomplices from the first Twilight, because again, in the same way that Beatrice lives even when Shannon and Cannon are killed, Ronove might live where Genji has died. But I think there's a chance that Eva came out to see to this herself alongside Beatrice, and there's a very specific reason I think that, and it's because the doors were locked from the inside. That could have come about by Eva letting them both leave and then locking the door behind them. But there's a specific thing that also has to happen in this section, which is that George has to leave. Now I think Nazi and Kraus leave to go have their chat, whatever, rendezvous, whatever's going on. George then sees Beatrice, and George sees Beatrice or sees Shannon. And then he goes outside to figure out what's going on, because at that point he's like, oh my god, is she actually not dead? He had literally just been having a conversation that he would sacrifice his life for a chance to see Shannon. So it's not unreasonable to think he would do something terribly dangerous because of the possibility that he would see his girlfriend. Ava does not know George has done this, but Ava still locks the door behind George because she wants to make sure that it seems like a strange closed room setup. I don't know why she would do this, is a reasonable question, because it does throw suspicion on her in a sense. It pushes the witch narrative, and Ava's maybe not thinking too clearly at this point because of how distraught she's become, so she may be somewhat acquiescing to the witch's ideas of how they should conduct the rest of the weekend and the rest of the murders. But this certainly explains why when Ava comes back and Kreis and Nazi are missing, she's just like, oh, that's strange. I wonder where they could be, and she waits. But then as soon as she knows George is missing, she is panicked, because that was not part of the plan. He should be in the guest house, and if he's not in the guest house, he could be with the accomplice that she has murdering people, and she has no idea what would come of that. Now, we've seen the magical narrative of what happened with George. It feels depressing to suggest that the non-magical narrative involved George being lured out because he thought he saw his wife, because he thought he saw his fiancée, and she brought him into a room and just stabbed him. As strange as it might be to say, I think the more compassionate reading I would suggest is that Beatrice took pity on George in the way she did in the magical narrative and brought him into the mansion. Did not, strictly speaking, tell him everything, but did not think he could live on, and so gave him a moment with Shannon before killing him. Now, this was not part of Ava's plan, so I do feel like this is a bit of a motivation hole, where I'm unclear on what Beatrice as an accomplice wants to do in this situation. Is she going along with Ava's plans? Is she following the murder game setup and just going through that formula? Or is she partly enacting an agency? Is she maybe a little bit ashamed about how far they've gone? Is she having second thoughts, especially with Ava in the driver's seat and starting to feel bad about things? That feels like the major weakness of the logistics I've suggested here. But I feel like the moving parts mostly make sense. Of people coming and going. I think Battler's idea of the window that is open and can't be heard is maybe a red herring, where Battler is trying to find a more roundabout explanation for something as simple as George went through the front door but no one was there to notice. But it is possible that George went through a window and Ava just also locked that, not really thinking about the fact that why did she have to lock a window and a door. But I think it just makes more sense that he just went through the front door and Battler's trying to find unusual answers so that he doesn't have to be suspicious of people. Although his answer is still somewhat suspicious of people, but it's very different in that he's still accepting the premise that Ava was where she said she was, without necessarily fully trusting that she was not doing anything at all untoward or not telling them about anything. Yeah, the next spoiler episode might be the ending. That might be the last of these style of Whodunnit sections anyway. So I, as usual, feel like I have holes in what I'm proposing, and I am very, very interested to know what the thinking behind the accomplice of Beatrice might be. But I feel like I've gotten some stuff figured out at least, and I'm looking forward to finding out if I was just way off or not. Thank you for watching. I look forward to reading all the spoiler comments about stuff that I completely missed once I've done my last video of speculating. But until next time, thank you for watching. See you in the next video.